the question we're all asking: why has the West become a giant, swirling, champagne supernova, vortex black hole of garbage? Well, the answer, I think, is multiple. It requires knowledge, I would say, of different fields, not just modern political developments, which is where most people who try to solve this issue, all these YouTubers talking about it, a lot of the alt media that tries to deal with this issue, they look at it from the perspective of modern political theories and developments, and they don't really take a broader perspective going back, say, the last 1,000 years, 2,000 years to the history of the West. And in my view, we have to look at both the theological, the philosophical, and the economic developments of the last 1,000 years to really understand how the West took the trek it did. Because prior to the schism of the Eastern and Western churches, for example, there was a common theological and philosophical heritage and perspective. And then with the rise of the papacy, with the Carolingians, that is Charlemagne and his theologians, and the theological changes that they made in their day in the West, this caused a split in the church. And this is why, for example, the change in the creed would become normative in the West, whereas prior to that, there was one creed. And so that has a lot more impact than people know or understand. A lot of people want to have some wider conspiracy theory that, oh, it was all Abrahamic religion. That's just a giant conspiracy of the Jews to destroy Europe or Western culture or something like that, which is ludicrous. There's not one Western culture prior to the expanse of Christianity through the Roman Empire and Koine Greek and so forth, right? So the Roman Empire tolerated any of the sects, right, that were statist. As long as you hailed Caesar, you could be tolerated in Rome. And Christian theology produced so many martyrs because it was not statist. It did not allow for Caesar to be believed in as divine or the Son of God. And that's why for the first 300 years of the church, you have so many martyrs. Then you have the period of the conversion, right, where much of the empire has been converted, and you have a lot of, and I don't believe that this is some stupid Seventh-day Adventist nonsense of that these are pagans. I mean, that's just total idiocy. If you just go read the church fathers for the first 500 years, which I have at length, then you're going to see that they teach all the same things that we do in Orthodox theology. Now, so what happens is you have a split of the East and the West based on two different approaches to theology. The Western approach is dominated by Augustinian theology, and I know a lot about this because for most of my 20s, I was very devoted to Augustine. I read his City of God. I read in full. I read most of his works against the Donatists, against the Pelagians, and many of the other philosophical and theological works as well, many of his letters. And on the Trinity as well, what you learn is that there is a difference in approach and belief in the Trinity. And while Augustine's theology and speculations might have been tolerated for a while from the ecumenical perspective, right? And when I say ecumenical, that means oikumene, that means the expanse of the Byzantine Empire. They were not normative, right? The normative theology for how we would look at the Incarnation or the Trinity is from the Eastern Fathers and from the seven councils that produced the theology of those Eastern Fathers and collated it, basically. So you have these 8 councils, and we hold them as normative, first 7/8. And there are more councils, but these are important because they were the period in which the church was united both East and West. And so those councils for us are very important into seeing how the philosophy and theology and worldview of the first 1,000 years of the church was formed. And anybody, I think, who's honest, who really delves into that, I've delved into it for the last 13 or 14 years, thousands of pages. What you see is that it's very clearly the same thing that the Orthodox Church teaches today. And the fact that the Orthodox Church continues on without the papacy shows that one of the chief arguments that the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, always tries to make is not true, right? They always say that there's no way to have church unity without the papacy, and your church won't last. Well, the Eastern Church has lasted for the last 1,000 years, and we've not fallen apart because of a lack of the papacy, or the Orthodox churches have not fallen apart because of a lack of imperial state authority either with the fall of Byzantium. So the fact that the church continues on shows that it's really the spiritual power behind it that keeps it going. And in fact, that the doctrines have not changed. With most religions, you see this evolving over time, and the theology or the philosophy is co-opted by the state power almost invariably. But if you look at the history of Orthodoxy, what you would think is you would think that there were all of these state-controlled monarchs, right? But in actual fact, if you look at the history of the church, there are many cases where monarchs tried to change the doctrines of the church and were later condemned or at a council, right? So you have heretical emperors at times. You have people like St. Maximus the Confessor, giving testimony, losing his hand actually, for opposing the imperial doctrine that was incorrect, that was heretical. So this is, the church, the history of the church is kind of murky when it comes to the relationship to the state. But the actual fact of the matter is that the Orthodox Church, its doctrine, its dogma has not changed. We can look back to all of the church fathers, from Justin, from St. Irenaeus, to St. Ambrose, to the Cappadocians, to St. Gregory Nyssa, all the way up into St. Cyril of Jerusalem, St. Cyril of Alexandria. We can read Maximus the Confessor. We can read St. John of Damascus's On the Orthodox Faith. Now, I've read all of those extensively. You can see it right here, this set here. I've read probably 10,000 pages out of the Church Fathers set. And you can see that they teach consistently the same doctrine that the Orthodox Church teaches today. So in our view, this is really the problem of the West is much earlier than political developments of the French Revolution or ideas that, come about through nominalism with William of Ockham. All of those things are relevant, but it's really that there's sort of a long train of ideas that flow out of the doctrine of God, or absolute divine simplicity in the West, right? And so in our view, the West has a theological and philosophical outworking that's problematic, that leads it down the road of atheism. And this is what St. Gregory of Palamas told Barlaam when they were debating this. Barlaam represented, in many ways, Western theology and a kind of Platonism. And when he was arguing with St. Gregory, he said, why don't you believe that there's a beatific vision and all this stuff, and he didn't understand it. St. Gregory was saying, look, the presuppositions of your theology are actually going to lead to atheism, and that's what we see the West doing. The West just goes totally into atheism, and once you have atheism, there's not really any foundation. Anything can come and go. And I would recommend too, if you're into philosophy and history, Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, which is really good. It gives a kind of, it's almost like the way Daniel pictures history in the book of Daniel, where Daniel sees the giant image and it has these sections that all refer to different stages and phases of history. And in the same way, that's a kind of an analogy to what Spengler sees in history, is that civilizations or cultures have a cycle or a phase, right? Like a birth, and then a flourishing, a nexus point, and then they kind of have a decline after that. And so he has a really unique approach. I disagree with Spengler's historicism and relativism, because what he tends to say is that you can't really understand or grasp the milieu or the ethos or the spirit of another culture, another civilization or history without being part of it existentially, right? And so this kind of historicist relativism would mean basically that numbers, this is the critique I'm giving, that like numbers function differently in Greece than they do nowadays, which that doesn't make any sense. I mean, the same, we use pi, or we use geometry in the same way or logic in the same way that Aristotle did, right? And we are inheritors of that kind of a tradition in the West. So it doesn't make any sense to try to kind of arbitrarily encapsulate ideas like mathematics into a certain culture or a certain time period. I think that's the error of Spengler, but there are many, many insights. I mean, he's a lot better of a historian than anything we might get in modern history, like Howard Zinn. I mean, these people are nothing compared to the mental giant of a Spengler. Again, doesn't mean that Spengler's right in everything. He and his students, like Francis Parker Yockey, they did not foresee things like the cryptocracy. Now, they were very aware of monetarism and the control of the banking elite, and the idea of homo economicus, that modern man is basically economic man, a tradable unit. And so that's all true, and I would say that's accurate. But what we have to understand is that you can't try to fix today's problems politically. And this is what so many people in alt circles and alt-right and alt-whatever and alt-media, they all seem to think that there's like a political solution to man's problems. And really the whole of modernity is built on this neo-pagan concept of political salvation. And there is no political salvation for man, because man's problems are not essentially political. They're spiritual. And that's the problem with trying to raise up political parties or whatever. I mean, I've said this all along, even in my political skepticism, and even in the time periods back in my 20s when I was maybe more actually politically active. I haven't voted since I was 18. Voting is laughable and ridiculous, but at times you maybe go through these phases when you're younger, or you think that, well, maybe there's some good that could be done through politics. But really what you start to see is that when you understand that the world that we live in is about big power blocks, and those power blocks are essentially controlled by large-scale money, the money power, there's not really anything that you can do to save the world, quote unquote, politically. And this is the error of all of the modern approaches, whether it's socialist, whether it's fascist, whether it's communist, whether it's capitalist, libertarian. They all try to solve man's problems through some secular political issue or economic thing. And that's never going to happen, because man's problem is deeper than that. This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. You can get my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, signed at my website. Thank you for listening or watching.